Good morning. Good morning to everybody, especially those who are from Washington, D.C. Really, we are happy, that at 5 o'clock in the morning you are taking part in this very important and very interesting forum. My name is Andrius Kubilius. I am a member of European Parliament from Lithuania, and also I am one of the founders of informal forum which we created here inside of European Parliament last year, and which has very specific title, Friends of European Russia Forum. Yeah, we have some kind of sound problems, but now we shall resolve them. And really, we had several meetings before of our forum. Before pandemic, with physical presence. Now pandemic taught us, and we learned a lot about Zoom and WebEx and things like that. And we are trying to use them also for our joint activities. And of course, topic of Russia of today, Russia of yesterday, and Russia of tomorrow is very important, especially during those days. And that's why I'm very, very happy and proud that, we have brilliant group of speakers, real experts on Russia. There is no need for long introduction, to explain who is Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is, again, thanks for joining us, from Washington, D.C. at 5 o'clock in the morning, so Vladimir, really appreciate very much. Konstantin Eggert, again, everybody knows, his and listens to his analysis either in some websites of Russia or in Deutsche Welle, and we're proud for that. For quite a period of time, Konstantin is, together with us in Lithuania. And now he can report how Vilnius is looking like, because I'm sitting in Brussels, and that's how new world is looking like. Dr. Maria Snegovaya, also very well-known expert on Russia. There is no need to introduce very much now. Again, thanks a lot for joining us from Washington, D.C. And the last one, again, very well known, Roland Freudenstein, policy director from Wilfred Martin Center, whom we know really as I'm always calling him, the whole brains of EPP, and at least in foreign and security policy. So really, there is no need to tell what we shall discuss, what topics we shall discuss. Of course, we, as members of European Parliament, who especially from Lithuania, from Baltic states, we are watching very carefully what is going on in Russia. We read new history explanations, made by new historian, Vladimir Putin. That was, very, very interesting to read, especially that resolution, which he, still is very angry on, was drafted in computers of our offices here, So fortunately, he thinks that that was done by Polish members of European Parliament, so we are not trying to how to say to argue with him on that, but his reaction to that resolution really is interesting and important. And of course, his statements recently again that Soviet Union collapsed in an illegal way, and some former members of Soviet Union went out from that empire in an illegal way, with some special, very big gifts, territorial gifts, from Russia. That's something again interesting to hear your comments on that. Of course, we were watching also military parade, but also we are looking into a few next days on this plebiscite on constitutional amendments. And that's where, again, we are waiting for your comments. What does it mean? Shall Russia have, President Putin forever? Or shall Mr. Putin will become, as I called, at some time, Ayatollah of Russian nation. So that's again interesting to listen to your comments. And my last question is, of course, since we are quite heavily involved in watching what is happening in Belarus. So my question to speakers is very simple: is here Babariko of Russia? Is there anybody like Babariko in Russia, or when Russia will have its own Babariko? So that's the last question, which I would like to also to hear your comments. And now, really, I am switching to speakers. And first of all, I'm asking Vladimir Kara-Murza, to say your point of view. A round of 10 minutes, and then after all speakers will speak, we shall have discussion and Q&A session. And I am asking audience to be ready for that. You can write your questions on chat, or you can ask for floor, and we shall try to manage the whole discussion. So Vladimir, please go on.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Kubilius, for hosting our meeting this morning. Thank you to the Friends of European Russia Forum and the Martin Center for its support. It's wonderful to join such distinguished colleagues, although I'm very much looking forward to the day when we're finally able to do it in person in one room, as opposed to doing all of this technical stuff that we've all had to switch to in the last few months. As we know from Russian history, periods of political repression are usually accompanied in our country with quite good political jokes, as people seek, kind of a way to a safe, or sometimes not very safe way to criticize the authorities. But good humor is always an accompaniment of totalitarianism in Russia. And one of the jokes, that Soviet era jokes, that I was remembering in the last few days was the one about, the local Communist Party official one morning coming into the office and seeing the secretary of the party committee running around the office, tearing his hair out in a state of panic. And the official asks, Comrade Secretary, what's going on? What's happened? And he said, well, somebody broke into the office last night and stole all the official election results. And the official said, well, Comrade Secretary, don't worry. They're all, they've all been published in newspapers. It's very easy to go and find them. He said, no, you don't understand. They stole next year's election results from the office. And I couldn't help remembering that joke when I read that last week, several leading bookstores in Moscow began selling booklets with the Russian constitution as amended by Vladimir Putin, long before this so-called plebiscite has started. And it started yesterday, as we know, with a week-long early voting that will culminate on the main polling day next Wednesday, the 1st of July. And there have already been several pieces of legislation that were passed and published that contain references to these new clauses in the Constitution that have officially not yet been approved. But I think that tells you all you need to know about this sham that we're witnessing today. There are 206 constitutional amendments in total that are being put to a yes or no vote in one single package. My colleagues will speak more about the substance of these amendments, but you can basically divide them up in a few categories. There are just meaningless ones, like, for example, in the old version, or still the current version of the Russian Constitution, it says that the State Duma has to approve the appointment of the Prime Minister. In the new version, the State Duma will confirm the appointment of the Prime Minister. And I've yet to meet a single person who can explain the difference between the two, but yet it's being presented by the Kremlin as a step to increasing the powers of Parliament. Then there are amendments that are just basically populist slogans with no substantive way to be implemented, like the fact that the health service should be freely accessible to all, or that the minimum wage should conform to a minimum living standard. First of all, these are all things already enshrined in Russian law, and second, it's not very clear how what this will mean in terms of implementation in practice. Then there are very harmful things like new restrictions on candidates for elected office, for example, that are being introduced, especially for the presidency, or the new provision that gives the Russian authorities the right to ignore, to not implement decisions by international bodies, meaning, of course, most of all, the European Court of Human Rights, which for Russia, as a member of the Council of Europe, is de facto the highest judicial authority. And we already saw last week that the Venice Commission, the main commission dealing with legal matters of the Council of Europe, has made a public ruling that this clause is harmful, that this clause directly violates the Russian Federation's obligations as a member of the Council of Europe. And then, of course, the final and the most important constitutional amendment is the one that's the real reason for all of this change and all of this plebiscite and everything that's been happening in the last few months. And that is, of course, the amendment that waives presidential term limits for Vladimir Putin, allowing him to remain in the Kremlin, at least according to their design, at least until 2036. And just step back for 1 second and just entertain that thought that, you know, in a European country in the 21st century, one man wants to stay in power for 36 years. That is the real reason for all of this shenanigan that we're seeing today. And in the worst traditions, you know, Soviet times, it was introduced at the last moment and ostensibly as a popular initiative, as you know, from Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman cosmonaut, who's now a member of the Duma for the ruling United Russia Party, and who kind of already introduced this amendment, and it was passed and included in the constitutional package. This, of course, has not come as a surprise to most of us, I think. You know, dictatorships and term limits generally don't go well together. There are some exceptions, although the most prominent exception, communist China, actually recently abolished term limits. But generally, dictatorships and term limits don't go together. And I think it's been clear since at least 2003, which to my mind is kind of the main turning point in terms of the consolidation of authoritarian regime in Russia, and a turning point on the way from the imperfect democracy that we had in Russia before Putin to the perfect authoritarian state that we have today. That year, 2003, three major things happened. The first was the closure of the last nationwide independent television channel, TVS, in June. Then in October, the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of the most prominent opponents of Vladimir Putin, who spent 10 years, more than 10 years in prison. Finally, in December of that year of 2003, the first parliamentary election in Russia since the end of Soviet rule that was assessed by European and international observers as not fair. And that resulted in basically the ejection of genuine opposition from the Russian parliament. So from at least that year, I think it was clear that Vladimir Putin wants to remain ruler for life. But he entertained several different options for doing so. For example, becoming chairman of this newly constituted state council. You mentioned Belarus, Prime Minister Kubilius. Another idea was to have a new country created through a merger of Russia and Belarus. All of those ideas were eventually abandoned. And in the end, Vladimir Putin traveled the road that was much traveled before him by dictators all over the world, from Uzbekistan to Venezuela to Bolivia to Egypt, many other such regimes who simply did away with term limits, abolished the term limits to allow them to stay in power indefinitely. This is what Putin is planning to do. Of course, in normal circumstances, it would have been really difficult for him to do it. Because if you look at the state of public opinion in Russia today, or in the last few months, even before the pandemic, that's important, you will see that even given all the caveats and all the restrictions on measuring public opinion in an unfree authoritarian society, you will see significant resistance from Russian public opinion to the idea of Putin remaining ruler for life. I'll give just a couple of examples. So in March, there was a big survey published by the Levada Center, so the last remaining credible independent pollster in Russia, that showed that this main amendment, waiving presidential term limits for Putin, has split Russian society exactly in half. 48% against 47%. You know, hardly the massive majorities that the Kremlin keeps telling us about. And very significant as well, I think, given the, you know, what some political scientists are calling an authoritarian bias, where many people are hesitant to state their true opinion about the regime for obvious reasons when asked this question by the pollsters. Regardless of this question has split Russians in half. And I would say a much more telling, actually, result was that 58% in the same March survey by the Levada Center, 58% of Russian citizens said that they think that the president should not be older than 70 years of age. Now, everybody knows that Vladimir Putin will turn 72 in 2024. So it's a safe, euphemistic way of opposing Putin without saying his name. And I think that is a much more telling result. And this was before the pandemic. Again, I want to stress because it's important. And before the Russian government's rejection of direct stimulus payments to citizens and businesses affected by the pandemic and the crisis. Russia was the only G20 country where the government refused to offer universal stimulus payments to citizens. And if you look at more recent figures, they're even more striking. And just about a month ago, the Levada Center came out with a poll that showed the public confidence in Vladimir Putin in an open poll. So where the respondents themselves have to name the person that they trust, the politician that they trust. Public confidence in Putin, according to that poll, has plummeted to 25% from 59% just 3 years ago. And again, this is astonishing given all the restrictions that Russian society operates under. And finally, just this week, Novaya Gazeta published the results of a survey specifically on the constitutional amendments, which show that more people, more Russians actually would support alternative constitutional amendments prepared by the Public Constitutional Council, which is this kind of a expert body which was established by Yabloko, the main liberal opposition party in Russia. And those amendments are the exact opposite of what Putin is proposing. So they would, for example, institute a limit of 2 4-year presidential terms. They would provide for an elected Senate. They would provide for election of presidents of courts by court members as opposed to their appointment by the Kremlin. They would provide for parliamentary nomination of the prime minister, many other things that go in a direction of democratization of the political system. And so more Russian citizens prefer those amendments than the amendments provided by Vladimir Putin. So I think it's fairly clear that had there been a real referendum on these amendments, and especially on Putin's intention to stay on in power beyond 2024, he would have, in all likelihood, lost that referendum. And that is why we're not having a referendum in Russia. Instead, what we're having is what Ella Pamfilova, the chair of the Central Electoral Commission, has referred to as разовая уникальная акция, a one-time action or a one-time event of sorts. That's exactly what she said. It's a procedure that's not provided for by Russian legislation. Officially, it's called общероссийское голосование, so all Russian vote. Putin himself referred to it several times as a plebiscite. And here I think the terminology is important. A plebiscite is a term borrowed from European fascist dictatorships of the 20s and 30s and later. Mussolini and Hitler and Franco held plebiscites. This is what we are having now, as of yesterday and until next Wednesday. There are basically no rules. While we see ubiquitous state-sponsored propaganda, from every TV station, every fridge, as we say, in support of these amendments, people who tried to create a no campaign were prevented from even having a website. The website was blocked by Roskomnadzor, which is the Russian government agency responsible for the internet. The rallies are being banned, of course, because of the pandemic. So there's no problem with the pandemic for holding a vote, but for holding a rally, that's a big problem, apparently. Of course, we're seeing the usual stories in the media about public sector employees being forced and coerced to vote for these amendments. But those are not even the most important things in the current conditions, because I think the most important aspect of this vote, and it is important that our friends and colleagues in the European Union understand this particular aspect, is that the official results that will be announced next week will have absolutely nothing to do with the real expression of the will of the Russian electorate. It's not going to come as news to anyone that we have not had a free and fair and democratic election in Russia for a long time. If you look at the reports from the observer missions of the OSCE and the Council of Europe that would take as a gold standard of election observation in Europe, we see that the last national election in Russia that was accepted as more or less free and fair and democratic took place in March of 2000. That was the election that first brought Putin to power. I think many of us can argue even with that acceptance, but at least if we take their word, that was the last time. Every national election since then, beginning with the parliamentary election in 2003, was not accepted as free and fair and democratic. But, at least in many of those cases, we knew the difference between the official announced tally and the actual result of the election. For example, in 2003, there was a parallel vote count organized by the Communist Party using poll monitors with primary protocols at all the polling stations across Russia that ironically did not actually find much vote theft from the communists themselves, but found significant vote theft from the liberal parties, Yabloko and the Union of Right-Wing Forces, the parties of Grigory Yavlinsky and Boris Nemtsov. And as a result of that vote theft, both of these liberal parties were thrown out of the Russian parliament. Of course, we all remember 2011, when there was large-scale ballot stuffing and fraud, made public by independent poll monitors, showing that something like 14 million votes were basically artificially created for Putin's party. The result was artificially inflated by 14 million votes, and we all remember the mass protests that were caused by that fraudulent election. This time, next week, we won't even know the difference. As Grigory Milkanyans, who's the head of the Golos organization, the independent vote monitoring group in Russia, has quipped last week that even the government this time won't know the actual result of the vote. Just look at the rules that they've created for this event. First of all, there will be no independent observation, not by opposition parties, not even by the media. Forget about international organizations. Council of Europe and OSCE are not invited. The only poll monitors will be appointed by the public chamber, which is this Kremlin-controlled semi-official body. There will be no universal video surveillance at polling places. In fact, the voting will not happen just at polling places, but as we saw from yesterday when early voting began, it's happening in makeshift tents, in cars, literally in the middle of the streets. It's all these, makeshift polling places that I can't even call polling places, that basically just enough to look at the photos, I think, from the Twitter feed yesterday to see in what conditions the so-called vote is taking place. As I already mentioned, there's a week-long early voting that began yesterday, which means that every night those ballots are stored in electoral commissions with no outside oversight or control. And we've known many cases before in Russian elections where pro-regime candidates would lose on election day, but would still be declared winners on the strength of a 98 or 99%, Soviet-style result in early ballots. I think we'll see the same thing this time. There will be unlimited mobile voting at home. People will be able to randomly choose the polling place they want to vote in as opposed to the one they should be registered at. And more than 1 million people in Moscow and in Nizhny Novgorod will be participating in this new experiment of remote electronic voting with no paper trail and with no way to guarantee either the safety of the identity or the secrecy of the ballot. And I can go on for a long time, but the point to this is that, as Grigory Milkanyan said, not even the government will know the actual results of this plebiscite. And I think there are two important takeaways from this. One concerns us domestically in Russia, and the other, I think, is important from the point of view of the international community. So I'll start with the domestic one. The Russian opposition, the Russian pro-democracy opposition, has been split over what to do in the so-called plebiscite. Significant part of the opposition, and that includes Alexei Navalny and his movement, and that includes the Yabloko party, are calling for a boycott of this vote because it's illegal, because it's extra-constitutional, because it's completely sham. Yabloko issued a statement a couple of weeks ago with words from the first Psalm of David, "Blessed is the man that sits not in the council of the ungodly," to call on their supporters to ignore this procedure and not to go out and participate in this sham. And by the way, everyone agrees that it is a sham. Even those people in the Russian opposition, like, for example, Dmitry Gudkov, a former opposition member of parliament, who will still go and vote no on the ballot just so that they personally, for themselves, know that they have said no to this dictatorship and to this lifetime rule, that they have rejected it. It's more of an emotional than any rational political consideration, but I think it's a view that should be respected as well. In any case, both of those kind of camps understand perfectly well that in the system that Vladimir Putin has created in Russia, just as in so many other post-Soviet and post-communist states in Europe, the political fate, the political future of Russia will not be decided at the ballot box. Unfortunately, it will be decided on the streets. It will not happen next week. It will not happen next month. It will probably not even happen next year, but it will certainly happen much, much sooner than 2036. And then one word about the international public opinion and the international organizations, which I think is very important. Up to this point, even with all the shenanigans and tricks that Putin used to remain in power for 20 years now, first with putting in Medvedev as a puppet president for 4 years and coming back to the Kremlin himself, and toying with all of these different ideas about Belarus and so on, he has still tried to keep, at least ostensibly, at least formally speaking, behind this fig leaf of legality or legitimacy. I think it is important, especially for our friends and partners in the rest of Europe and European Union and international community and organizations of which we are a part, like the OSCE and the Council of Europe, to say openly and clearly that what is happening now until next week with this abolition of term limits through this sham fake plebiscite finally and irrevocably puts Vladimir Putin in the same league as Karimov was in Uzbekistan, or Lukashenko in Belarus, or Blaise Compaoré in Burkina Faso, and all of these other dictators who have gone for this most unsophisticated route of waiving term limits. And that as of next Wednesday, the 1st of July, Putin and his regime should be denied any remnants, any vestiges of international legitimacy and international acceptance. And I think it would be very important next week to hear from members of the European Parliament, and hopefully also from officials of the European Council and European Commission, an unequivocal statement to this effect. And finally, I want to thank once again the Friends of the European Russia Forum for not only for organizing our conversation today, but for all the work it has been doing. Because one of the most, frankly, insulting things that we as Russians, as those Russians who are in opposition, sometimes hear from Western politicians is that basically Russia and the Putin regime are one and the same thing. They never make any distinction between a nation and an authoritarian clique that misrules that nation. It's insulting, as I said. It's also not true, because there are many, many, many people in Russia who have a very different vision for the future of our country, for the lack of a better shorthand, a European vision for the future of our country. And I want to thank you, Prime Minister Kubilius, and your colleagues and the organizers of the forum for making that distinction. And I think it is very important for those of us in Russia and our friends and partners in the rest of Europe to continue working together to bring a little bit closer that day when that European vision for Russia will finally be realized. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thanks a lot, Vladimir. Thanks really very much for your really overview of what is going on with those amendments and plebiscite or whatever, how it's called. Really, we shall see how we can react next week. Now in chat, I saw one wish that you should put maybe to the chat links to the surveys. If you have, now people are asking, they're interested.
Absolutely, I'll do that now. I'll try to find them in English. If not, I'll put the original Russian links, and then those who don't speak Russian, hopefully Google Translate will do the trick. I will do that now. Yeah,
okay. Now we are asking, Konstantin, your floor is yours. Of course, I am very bad manager of time, but your thoughts are so interesting that I cannot interrupt you now.
Yeah, well, but I mean, still, we need to leave time for questions. How much time do I have?
You have around 10 minutes, but as always. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I mean, I just want to repeat the thanks to the Friends of European Russia Forum. It is very important what Vladimir said about maintaining faith in the capacity and ability of the Russian people to manage their own affairs in a democratic, transparent way with free will and free expression. I will take off from, to some extent, where Vladimir has left and speak more about the foreign policy implications of what we are seeing right now and of Vladimir Putin's recent statements, including his famous or infamous, depending how you look at it, piece in the national interest. Now, with regard to the vote, one thing I would like to say is that it's not, Vladimir said it is completely illegal. There is nothing like that in any of the Russian laws. It is, in fact, juridically null and void already. It was designed it's not a vote, even to some extent. It's organized as a popular acclamation of Vladimir Putin for the sake of propaganda inside the country, but also for the outside world. So don't think it doesn't concern you and your countries. It does concern, because it does concern you, and it does concern your bilateral and multilateral relations, because representatives of Russia, be it members of the so-called Duma or members of the diplomatic corps, are going to be given instructions next week to go and propagate these results as yet another confirmation that Putin is the only game in town. And another message they're going to push is that if it's not Putin, then it's chaos. He stands between order and horrible Russian Nazis or horrible Russian communists or some other Russian horrors, because Russians can't manage their affairs. And let's be frank, there's going to be a lot of takers for this particular message, including in your countries where you are working, where you are citizens, where you are MEPs. We don't have to name them, but well, let us say we know all countries in the European Union, and we know the capitals, to name Berlin and Paris is just a couple, where this message is being 24/7 pushed, not only by RT, Sputnik, and the rest of the Russian propaganda, but by business associations, friendly MPs, and unfortunately quite a few members of the executive. I think that for Putin, this acclamation is very important, and one qualification straight away. In Russia, we all became a bit of, sort of amateur shrinks, amateur psychoanalysts analyzing Putin, because he's actually the only politician in Russia that counts. And because of that, we kind of learned to know what he means when he says something and what he means when he doesn't say something. So what we've seen in the last few weeks is actually this amalgamation of the vote that's going to take place, or is actually taking place now, as Vladimir said, and burnishing Putin's credentials as someone who saved Russia from the chaos of the Yeltsin era, someone who in fact incarnates Russia for the domestic purposes and for the outside world. And I think when we read Putin's piece for the national interest, and when we see documentaries now being shown by Russian television, Russian state television, actually there is no television in Russia but state-controlled television to speak of, we see that there is a very specific message that's being pushed. First of all, it's a message of revisionism. And this revisionism goes back now not only to 1991 or 1990, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall and dissolution of the Soviet Union. It goes all the way back to early days of the Soviet Union, because in his interview to Russian television a few days ago, 4 days ago, I think, Putin explicitly said that some republics joined in the early 20s with one territory and they left with another. And these territories were given to them as a gift from the Russian people, Russian meaning ethnically Russian. So why don't essentially they put back what they took away? So now we see this idea of Russia settling scores with the ungrates, former allies, former colonies in some ways, being risen to the level of state ideology. And that's a very important issue because, and that's number two, what we've seen proved in the last weeks is that there is nothing more important for Putin than Ukraine. It's a make or break for him, because foreign policy-wise, I mean, because this is what definitely he sees as his huge achievement. I mean, taking the Crimea. This is for him a very much an unfinished business, because he comes back to Ukraine all the time. And in this respect, I can say that Putin clearly shows he keeps all options on the table, be it internal destabilization of Ukraine, be it putting some pro-Russian politicians at the helm there, or be it maybe some new military action, because this is what you infer, at least this is a threat you infer from his words. Number three, and that's another thing that goes back to his piece in the national interest. Putin sees himself as not only guardian on Russian national interest, which by now in his mind is evidently completely conflated with his own interest. Je suis la Russie, that's his message essentially. But also he sees himself as to some extent guardian, to some extent creator or recreator of a realist-based world order in which 5 winners of the Second World War, 5 permanent members of the Security Council, essentially divide up the world and rule it with their veto power and their nuclear weapons. It's not for nothing that has been published in the National Interest, which is being edited by a political scientist whose name is Dmitry Simes and who was named in the Miller Report as agent of Russian influence in Washington. National Interest is published by a foundation headed by Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is a frequent guest of Putin's in the Kremlin. He's very respected by Putin exactly because Kissinger advocates making peace with authoritarians of this world, including Russia and China, by making concessions to them and by that maintaining stability. This is essentially the vision that Putin offers the world. And I can tell you, by now we know, over 20 years, Putin takes his public pronouncements, especially such widely publicized public pronouncements, like his Munich speech, for example, in 2007, as extremely important. He sees them as warnings he issues to the international community. It's not just some kind of chit-chat to convince Angela Merkel to talk to him or something like that. No, he positions himself as a strong man of this world, as someone who is going to remake the international system by basically continuing to push, as he does for many years, for this thing which, for lack of better description, we can call Yalta II. He is very much wedded to this idea. And I think that his constant ruminations on the Second World War are very important because for him, Second World War and Stalin are extremely important elements of the new narrative that he's going to give to the nation. I leave it to Maria to talk about it because I know she's going to talk about it. But let me give one specific qualification here. For Putin, in his writings and his public pronouncements, basically makes Russia and the Soviet Union look one and the same. So in a sense, his vision is very much of Russia continuing the Soviet policy. And in a certain way, I would say he feels pain, or he decides to avenge the injustices that were inflicted on the Soviet Union. What policy-wise does it mean? Well, apart from the fact that if I were Ukrainian, I wouldn't be particularly quiet, or I wouldn't be particularly calm. And other things come to mind. I'd say that Putin likes to surprise, and I think he will see his pronouncements this June as public warnings to the West that should be heeded. Because he says so much that, Russia's being offended, Russia's been unfairly treated. I do not think that even members of NATO can be completely calm about the possibility of some actions by the Russian government to test the resolve of NATO, maybe in the Baltic states, maybe on Gotland, maybe on Svalbard, Spitsbergen, I don't know. But definitely Putin sees, I think, a possibility of the next test that he can inflict on the West, somewhere probably outside Ukraine. That is my suspicion. One last thing. Vladimir talked about it, and I think probably Maria will talk about it too. We've seen in the last couple of years this marked tendency in the Russian public opinion to shy away, to take a step back from this expansionist foreign policy that Putin espoused in the last few years. It seems that the Russian public is a bit tired of the wars in Ukraine, in Syria, in Central African Republic, whatnot. And people are saying, well, because of that, Putin is not going to do anything. But frankly, we don't know what he actually thinks to some extent, because he takes decisions on his own, or talking to a couple of people that basically live in the same bubble of this imagined realist foreign policy. So I wouldn't be so sure that his decisions will be necessarily grounded in the reality which we all live in. And that's what makes it difficult to predict, dangerous, and unpredictable, really, really unpredictable. And even in the age of Donald Trump, Mr. Putin still prefers to see himself as the world champion, or at least a defending champion of unpredictability. And this is, I think, one trait of Russian foreign and security policy that's going to continue and to survive in the coming years. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Konstantin. Thanks a lot. And now I'm turning to Maria. Floor is yours, and please go on.
Dear all, good morning. I wanted to concur with previous participants that it's really a big honor to have this opportunity to talk about the recent Russian developments here. And thank you so much for the Friends of European Russia and Prime Minister Kubilius for organizing this event. Now, I just want to go back a little bit to what the constitutional changes represent more specifically for the distribution of power in Russia and what kind of changes we can expect as a result of these new amendments in terms of Russia's domestic and foreign policy. Despite the fact that, you know, the Putin himself and the representatives of the Kremlin commonly claim that these amendments do not directly contradict with the existing constitution, many legal experts who analyzed these changes actually argue otherwise. As a matter of fact, officially, the first several chapters of the existing Russian constitution have officially been left untouched by these newly introduced amendments. But if you look at the spirit of the law, of course, many of these amendments actually directly violate these chapters, and they do so in a way that's also not constitutional under the existing constitution, because the process for which the amendments have been introduced is also deeply violated, as Vladimir beautifully described before me. Just small reminder, it's not just about the way this constitutional quote-unquote vote is organized, it's also because of everything else that preceded the vote. In particular, just a reminder that the Kremlin appointed a very talented group, a working group of apparently sportsmen, artists, and occasional legal experts to design the amendments. And those were introduced, the working group of this apparently real professionals was very efficient because the amendments were developed in 4 days only. When you look at these designs more broadly, you notice 2 key elements. First of all, it seems that Putin realizes that he is not getting stronger and that his popularity is in decline. That's why, as a result, you actually see a very strongly reinforced presidency in a constitution that already, current constitution, grants the Russian president with a lot of authority. So even current constitution has been really often described as giving president extraordinary powers. But apparently that's not enough. And so as a result of the current amendments, the authority of the president is reinforced. This is actually not unprecedented, fundamentally new for Russia specifically. As a matter of fact, in the recent years, under this wave of spreading personalistic populism in Europe, post-Soviet space, and some African countries, we have seen a few incumbents actually introducing very similar changes that allowed them to stay in power for extended periods of time, and also very strongly reinforced their authority and control over different branches of power. Second of all, we also see the trend towards the so-called constitutional protectionism. Again, not necessarily Putin's own invention. We have seen these trends across many other countries, essentially that emphasize the uniqueness of national identity in an effort, honestly, in the final, with the final purpose to really provide a shield against the international legal system. And of course, most importantly, this is the amendment that actually allows the Russia's domestic legislation takes priority over the international ruling. That's very important as well. So very briefly, just to develop both of those points. The reinforcement of the personalistic autocracy is very visible in the existing outline. Present powers, despite the very fact that the existing Russian constitution, as I mentioned before, already grants the president with all sorts of arbiter power over not just executive, but also legislative and judicial branches. In the current amendments, we see that those trends have been significantly reinforced, further entrenching the president with excessive centralization of power. Specifically, the key points. First of all, the control over the constitutional court. This is very important point made by several prominent legal experts in Russia. Right now, the new amendments actually grant the president with the new authority to remove judges from the office, including constitutional court judges, by introducing a proposal to the upper house. Of course, with this new outline, you can't really talk about the independence of the judicial branch. It's one thing that the president, in some other constitutional designs, the president actually may appoint or present the candidacy for the constitutional judges, but having the power actually to de facto remove them is something completely unprecedented and of course very, very worrisome. Second of all, as I mentioned, the reinforced president control over the legislative branch. Here we see that despite, again, the official announcement that Putin made in his federal address in January 2020 when he introduced those amendments. As a matter of fact, the new changes do not reinforce the legislature of Russia, but deeply weaken it. As a matter of fact, right now, the control over the appointment of the prime minister is weakened in the new amendments. The prime minister role itself, it's really closer to the role of a typical regular minister rather than a certain independent position. The amendment also essentially no longer allows Duma, the parliament, to appoint or approve the executive branch ministers, such as, and that's important for foreign policy dimension, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Justice, Minister of Defense, Internal Affairs, and Emergency Situation. If anything, that suggests that the president will have even more control over the foreign policy making and the candidates of those ministers in Russia. There is also more power for the president to dissolve the lower house of Russia's parliament, Duma, and also additional authority to appoint new members of the upper house of parliament, the federal council. The federalism under these new amendments is also fundamentally weakened. Again, Russia is not a federal republic despite what's officially claimed already, but we see that more, even for this trend is even more reinforced in the existing arrangement. Specifically, right now, the president will get power to appoint regional prosecutors, which will give him control over regional law enforcement. And of course, again, a lot of legal experts pointed out the destruction of the independence of the municipal government. It's vague, but the current amendments essentially now argue that the municipal management system will now become the part of the unified system of public authority that's very reminiscent of the way it used to be in the Soviet times. The reason why the municipalities came in the attack is that it's actually one of the few remaining political windows for the opposition candidates to participate in the political process. In the recent years, many prominent Russia's opposition leaders actually ran and became members of the municipal governments, and apparently that wasn't unnoticed by the Kremlin, and right now this is actually destroyed. Of course, one of the most noticed amendments has to do with the so-called nullification. Even if de facto the amendments do not remove the term limits provisions, and if anything, they actually make the term limits more stringent because they eliminate the word in a row. So it says the same person cannot stay in power for 2 terms in a row. The small reservation in the existing constitution that actually allowed Putin himself to run in 2012 and 2018 after he already served 2 previous terms back in 2000. Yet, despite making this statement more stringent, at the same time, de facto, this amendment resets the number of terms for Putin, allowing him to stay in power by 2036, and of course, explains to us, outside observers, why the whole the amendments that reinforce the presidency were introduced in the first place. This centralized authority actually makes Russia's existing system even more reminiscent of personalistic autocratic systems that emerged in the recent years in post-Soviet countries, where again existing leaders tended to eliminate limit terms or extend their terms in order to stay in power longer, or personalistic autocracies in African societies, where again the so-called big man stayed in power for a longer period of times by either resetting the number of terms or extending the existing term limits in power. And of course, when it comes to the constitutional protectionism, this is the point, this is my other point. This is, again, the new trend in different constitutional, in different worldwide constitutions that actually create certain national shield against the international legal system by allowing the constitutions, domestic constitutions and legal system take priority over the ruling of the international courts. This is, of course, very worrisome, and this particular amendment has been considered by the Venice Commission recently, which actually recommended to revise it. But the Venice Commission only does not really any sanctuary power over Russia's legislation, so it seems that despite this suggestion, the current amendment is going to take place. And this so-called constitutional protectionism is also reinforced by constant references to uniqueness of Russia's identity. As Konstantin mentioned, also this national identity is highlighted through a number of additional amendments, such as the protection of historical truth about the defenders of fatherland, or the uniqueness of Russian Orthodox religious identity and things like that. But ultimate goal, of course, is to provide this shield against the international legal system. There's also an additional reinforced eligibility requirement for public office, again designed to limit access to public positions in the country. For example, people who have foreign citizenship, foreign residency, and hold any money in foreign bank accounts, no longer allowed to run for public office, will become members of public bureaucracy in Russia. This amendment, by the way, also directly contradicts the chapters 1 and 2 of the Russian Constitution, for example, about people's rights and freedoms in Russia and equality in front of the law of the Russian citizens. So as you can see, just to sum it up, overall, we see a very personalistic constitutional outline that reinforces the already very strong power of the Russian president. Also, many of the amendments directly contradict the constitutional chapters 1 and 2, and also chapter 9 in the existing constitution that are fundamental for the constitutional design in Russia today. Specifically when it comes to the foreign policy, because the president gets more power for the ministers, and it generally becomes even more, the checks and balances in the Russian system become even more shifted towards the president, you can definitely expect that the foreign policy making in Russia will become even more discretionary in the recent years. And my last point that I wanted to make, despite this really fundamental nature of the revisions to the constitution that we observed, unfortunately, they did not receive sufficient international attention. And hence, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to draw the attention of the international community to what's going on in Russia at the moment. In particular, very few international experts actually publicly speak out, spoke against the current situation, and we really, as the Russian society, the civic society domestically, really needs more support from the international community, drawing attention to how the newly introduced amendments actually contradict the existing constitution and directly violate some of its clauses. So we would really, the Russian civic society would really benefit if more international legal association and international institution really draw attention to what's currently going on in Russia. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, Maria. Thanks a lot. And now we're asking Roland, So how the international community and Brussels, institutions should look into what is happening in Russia. Please. Go on.
Thank you so much, Andrius. It's great to be with the Friends of European Russia. You know, as a Bavarian comedian once said, everything has already been said, but not by everybody yet. So all I can do is reinforce a couple of points. And I want to follow up to what Konstantin said about the revisionism. And I will also say a few words on how exactly the European Union, but more than the EU institutions, probably civil society should react in the West to what is going on presently in Russia. Indeed, I think Putin is an excellent disciple of George Orwell. He who controls the past controls the future, which is why this whole history politics is so hugely important. Just this week, you know, there was the inauguration of this kind of military Orthodox cathedral, with very graphic and very strong references to previous Russian wars and military exploits. Then, most spectacularly, of course, on the 24th of June, this the belated Dien Победы parade, you know, with tanks but without masks, and a massive presentation of military might, also accompanied by talks about new weapon systems, the hypersonic missiles and so on, figure very prominently. And this all, of course, also accompanied by a couple of populistic measures like, you know, taxing the rich, as if that would seriously help the budget problems of Russia. And this is not only to influence the result of the referendum or the plebiscite, whatever you want to call it, but this is also, you know, to give the, within Russia and for the world, a certain image, a certain Begleitmusik, as we would say in German. So what is this Dien Победы thing all about, and why is it so relevant to Russia's relations to its neighbors, to the rest of the world, but especially to Ukraine? Well, obviously, to celebrate May 1945 as something entirely good has implied for many years for Putin three things. The first thing is that, well, you certainly do not critically talk about Molotov-Ribbentrop, which was a tragedy not only for Poland, but for most of Central Europe. And, you know, in contrary to the Yeltsin years, in the early 90s, when Molotov-Ribbentrop was actually condemned unequivocally, you know, there has been a slow rehabilitation of this, and the peace in the national interest is a beautiful example of this revisionism, indeed. The second one, of course, logically, Yalta is not critically discussed. It is considered part of the victory, and you know, I think it is sometimes, even for West Europeans, it is hard to understand what a tragedy Yalta really was. You know, I mean, basically, it's not only the deportations, it's not only the installment of communist regimes, it is the disfiguration of half a continent, which comes into play. And the dimension of this is like, I think, was beginning to be discussed in Russia in the 90s, and again, total silence about this now. And the third aspect is, of course, that by celebrating 1945 and also celebrating 1939, or more specifically, the 17th of September 1939, i.e. the attack on Poland, on the rest of Poland, that was not occupied by Nazi Germany yet. Putin has laid a couple of clear connections to the context of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. You know, that in 1939, the Soviet claim was Poland is not a nation. You know, that was not only Nazi Germany and German nationalists which claimed this, but the Soviet Union also began to adopt this rhetoric. Poland is not a real nation. Just like in 2014, we heard Ukraine is not a country. Second, this meme of coming to the assistance of ethnic Russians. I mean, it was not a dominating narrative in '39, but it certainly played a certain role. And you all remember that in 2014 and following, it was a leitmotif of Russian aggression against Ukraine. And third, of course, and most importantly, this whole meme of fascism, of fighting Ukrainian fascism. Now that does not refer so much to, or there is not such a strong parallel to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but here is the parallel to 1945. You know, if 1945 was all about a victory over fascism, and you celebrate 1945, May 1945, in today's context, then you know, by default, legitimize any action against any free Ukrainian government, because you will always label it as quasi-fascist or controlled by Nazis and so on. And you know, this just to sum up now with a proper Western reaction to all this. And here I would like to refer to Tim Snyder, who you all know, he gave a speech in actually 2015 on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II in the European Parliament, in which he kind of made up the rule book of the right way of remembering history. You know, there is a wrong way, and he described the Dien Pobjedy in all its aspects as the wrong way to remember history. But then what is the right way? And this could be a guidebook for, as I said, European institutions, European political parties, but especially European civil society. So there are 4 criteria for historical remembrance to be constructive in Europe. The first one is that it has to be societal, based on civil society, coming not so much from governments, but coming from free associations of citizens, political parties, and NGOs, and so on. The second one is that it has to be international. It has to incorporate the points of view of other nations. You know, look at Vladimir Putin's piece in the national interest. There is zero consideration for what other nations felt about the things he's describing. So, you know, be it the victims, be it third parties, but other international points of view should be incorporated. And the third, and probably the most important criterion, it has to be critical, right? The negative side of one's history have to be looked at as well. And there is no single nation in Europe which doesn't have negative sides in its history. No one was always the victim. For Putin, particularly, in the whole revisionism, in the repainting of Soviet and Russian history, there is not one element of criticism. In fact, the whole thing is done in order to avoid a critical approach to one's history. And the fourth one is very important as well, fourth criterion. It's remembrance has to be responsible. It has to draw lessons from what went wrong in the past, including the mistakes of others and the mistakes of oneself, one's own country, but consequences and lessons from that for the future, and the attempt to act accordingly with neighbors, partners, and other countries in the world. So, you know, Putin's historical revisionism fails on all counts in these 4 points, and which is why we should, on all levels in which we encounter these historical narratives, we should push back with a clear insistence on those criteria, because otherwise the remembrance of history is license, not lessons, as Tim Snyder put it. Thank you.
Well, Roland, thanks a lot, really, and thanks a lot to all the speakers. It was very interesting to listen. Very important messages, very important thoughts and ideas. You know, you shared with us. Thanks a lot. And now we have some time now for Q&A or something like discussion. I will start myself, very simple question. Then I have one written question, and I got a message from my colleague Rasa Yuknevichina, who is leading in European Parliament, exactly remember the group that she wants to ask. So maybe we can collect, few questions, and then, you will decide by yourself, if the questions are not targeted to personally to one of you, which part of the questions you want to ask. So my question is very simple. And first of all, maybe to Maria or whatever, or Vladimir also. I'm in some kind of confusion. Yes, amendments to Constitution, it's important thing, and you elaborated very much what is going to happen, what are those changes, what do they mean? But since, really Putin is pushing the whole, authority system to something which is really authoritarian, and we can compare it with African regimes or some totally authoritarian regimes. So, of course, I remember immediately, Soviet time, and during Soviet time, we had also constitution, but it meant nothing. So, I mean, what constitution means for Russia of today? Is that really a meaning document, or is that something like, nice book, which is promising everything, communism on horizon and things like that. So that is my question. What does it mean, constitution in general? And should we look, so deeply into the details, or or should we, look like we were looking into constitution during Soviet time? Now I have one written question before we got from one of our colleagues, friends, Pavel Havlicek, who is leading EU-Russia Civil Society Forum. And we had interesting discussions recently. And his question sounds like this. How will the current run-up to the 1st July 2020 All-Russia vote and the ongoing manipulations, which Vladimir talked about, but also pushed back by the international community, including the Venice Commission, how it will impact the legitimacy of the post-2024 Russian leadership and its sustainability? So the question on legitimacy of that system, which will appear with new constitution, despite the fact what does it mean, but that's the question, and how that system will be sustainable. And I don't know, Katya, you can tell Rasa wants to ask, or?
I am. Do you hear? Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, you can ask. Okay.
Okay, so hello everybody. So nice to see you, despite that you cannot see me in Pilkagaliai. Somebody knows what does it mean, my village, at least Konstantin. But of course, thank you for your introductions. Myself, I am very close to the understanding you have, especially on foreign affairs, Konstantin already expressed. I just want to remind that it's not new deliberations, how to say, not new strategy for Putin. We have to remember 2007, the year when he addressed Munich conference. And at that time, not very many in the West accepted the messages he sent on Soviet Union, on his how to say, strategy for the future. And I think that he has an idea, despite that the main idea is to keep regime strong and powerful for a very long time. It's the main goal, but also he has an idea to restore Soviet Union in new, maybe, forms, and to build this strong, in his understanding, statehood as it was during Stalin period. So also I would like to draw your attention, we have to be very careful when we speak about the narratives or the terminology. For example, very many people say that Putin is rewriting history, or some revisionistic history. Revisionistic is a little bit better, but we have to be very clear. He is back to Stalinistic, to Stalin period history approach, and that is what it's very important to deliver and to send very clear messages about that. So I think that now we are approaching into the last period of Putin's political, biography, and my question is, will he try to do attempts to fulfill his vision of strong Soviet Union, maybe in a new historical situation, and what kind of the countries have to be most careful after his message on the lands were given or donated to the new countries after the Soviet Union collapse. Kazakhstan, Ukraine, of course, but Kazakhstan, maybe Belarus, or even Baltic states.
Well, Rasa, thanks a lot. Now I have indication of 2 more questions. Maybe we shall collect all of them. I don't know if panelists are ready to remember all of them, but let's try to do it in that way, and then you will have another, another possibility to speak. So first of all, I see one interesting question on chat, and I will try to read it. It's by George Salmanif. It seems Putin's his offense is the best defense. What impact is and will Belarus have on his near-term plans towards Ukraine? Will he have to recalibrate, and if so, what is he capable of doing in response? So that's one of the questions which I was trying to ask also, at the beginning. And then we have Marie Mendras asking the floor. So Marie, you should turn on your microphone if you want to speak.
Yes, I think it's on, right?
Yeah, it's on. Good.
Yes.
Good.
Hello, my friends, and thank you very much for 4 brilliant presentations. I have a very straightforward question, but maybe not that easy. Why do you think Putin made his announcement on the 15th of January? Why was he, or were they, in such a rush at the time? Surely the decline in popular support is not a sufficient reason. And just a quick comment. I'm afraid the so-called consultation or event of this will be presented in most European media as a plebiscite for Putin to stay. We are only really a few, I think, in Europe to carry another story.
So that's, maybe we shall finish the questions, with that list of the questions which we got. And now, I'm looking again in your thoughts, and you can react to whatever question or to each other, statement. So please, maybe we shall start again from Konstantin once. Yeah, okay. Please go on. Konstantin, then Vladimir, and Maria, and then Roland.
Yeah, I would like to answer the question regarding two questions, basically, give my certain impressions of 2 questions. With regard to Belarus, I do think that Putin feels that he has to, in the end, make Belarus toe the Moscow line. And I think that at the same time, he, for now at least, wants to refrain from whatever direct military intervention, some kind of very, very clumsy and in-your-face type of action. Also because it won't be that popular in Russia. I do think that what he wants to do, he wants by threatening Alexander Lukashenko to convince him to go along with at least some of the Moscow demands. And I would say, if you ask me what Lukashenko needs to do to have a complete indulgence on the part of the Kremlin, my idea is that it's Lukashenko announcing that Belarus is shedding its ruble and joining the Russian ruble zone. That will be more than enough for Putin to say, thank you very much. Вопросов больше не имею, no questions. Whether he's going to succeed in that, I'm not sure. But I think that basically he knows that to a large extent, President Lukashenko has painted himself into a corner. And on the other hand, he doesn't want to push it too much, because it's quite evident that among those who protest against President Lukashenko, and we've now seen at least some members of the security forces joining, not a lot of them would like to join Russia on Putin's terms. So he has to be very careful. And also there is, kind of this solidarity of authoritarians. You don't undermine other authoritarians. But I do think that he's trying to push Lukashenko to concede that he can't go on as before by invoking the Grand Duchy of Lithuania when speaking to the EU, and then evoking Slavic Brotherhood when speaking to Moscow. I do think that Putin feels now that he wants to make this, payback time, to make it closer, to move towards that with regard to Lukashenko. As for the question that Marie raised about why it happened on the 15th of January, it's a good question. Actually, to some extent, you can say that because the president always speaks to the Federal Assembly in January in the last few years, it's always in the beginning of the year, they thought that it's an opportune time to use it. Also, I do think that they thought before COVID-19 that it would be nice if everything would coincide with V-Day. So it will be this one huge reacclamation of Putin as creator of New Russia. So I think it had a lot of, if you wish, propaganda value when they thought about it. Plus, as you rightly said, they do read the real polls, not the kind of rubbish that Sion publishes. And they know that things are not moving their direction. So there was a certain element of, well, let's not rush it, but let's do it quickly. I wouldn't invest more than that into this particular timing. And last thing, what Andrew said at the very beginning, asked, is Russia going to have a Babariko? I mean, like if Gazprom is going to create a candidate, that's been funny. But I think that, I do think that there's already a potential contender, and that's, of course, Alexei Navalny. But I think that basically what Putin's been very good at is spending this 20 years to create a situation in public opinion, to instill in the public mind this idea that political competition is bad, that anyone who aspires to being a political leader is somehow a political, somehow a small-time careerist, and only whoever sits in the Kremlin, that's been Vladimir Putin for the last 20 years, is the real McCoy, is the real deal. And I think that he's been very good at limiting the scope of action for the opposition. I do think that starts to change, because my personal idea is that we have entered the twilight of Putin. It may be very long, like a summer twilight is long sometimes, but I think that it's a twilight for one simple reason. He won't be able to offer to the country any new and at the same time realistic vision for development. And this is something that that's, I think, above his capacity.
Thanks a lot, Konstantin. And now, Vladimir.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Kubilius. Thank you for all the very insightful questions. Before I address the question, just one technical thing. Prime Minister Kubilius, can you see, because for some reason I can't see previous messages in the chat anymore. Can you see the links? Because participants asked me to provide some links for the polls, which I did, but I don't know if they're still there. Can you see them?
I saw before, now I do not, yeah, something, yeah, I don't know, we shall try. No.
Okay, so what,
no,
do you see them?
Yeah, I see, still I see.
Okay,
so
thank you, because I don't, I just want to make sure they're still there. If not, I can put them there again. Okay, thank you. So you do see them. Okay, that's good. Very quickly on the questions, I want to address your question first. You asked if the Constitution is still meaningful. Will it have any meaning after these amendments are passed? Well, of course we know, and I think the analogy you drew with the Soviet Constitution that also provided for nice things like freedom of assembly and freedom of speech and so on. We all remember how well that was implemented. Our Constitution has lost meaning long ago. You know, we also have an article of freedom of assembly, Article 31. We know that people can go to prison for peacefully participating. We have an article on free and fair elections. We know how that works out in practice and so on. But I think there's an important distinction in that until now, the Constitution for several years now has been just a piece of paper, has been meaningless in practice. But after these amendments will have been passed, it also becomes self-contradictory. As Maria said a few minutes ago, you now have the first two chapters of the Constitution that are fundamental, that provide for some basic principles and basic rights and freedoms, and which cannot be amended. That's the only reason. It's not because of Kremlin's goodwill that it's not being touched. It's because they cannot be amended. But Articles 3 to 8, which can and will be amended, will now contradict chapters 1 and 2. For example, you know, Maria mentioned a few examples, like there are new limitations on eligibility for being elected for public office, which directly contradicts the principles outlined in chapters 1 and 2, that every Russian citizen, except those who are mentally incapable and who are convicted by a court of law and serve in prison, everybody else should have the right to be elected. Now there are all sorts of new restrictions introduced in the same document. Or of course, you know, there's still Article 15 of the Russian Constitution that provides for supremacy of international law. For example, Russia as a member state of the Council of Europe has to abide by the final judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. That's Article 46 of the Convention. Now there is this new article in the new part of the Constitution, or the amended part, that will say that, by the way, you know, when the Russian government basically doesn't want to implement those judgments, it doesn't have to, which contradicts not only our obligations before the Council of Europe, which the Venice Commission has already said, but also contradicts the Constitution itself. So I think that's an important distinction. So whereas before the Constitution was just meaningless in practice for quite a while now, for 20 years at least, it will now also become a self-contradictory document that is basically not going to be viable in any kind of long or even medium term. I want to address a comment that Mrs. Junkevičienė raised, and thank you so much for raising it. She said that, you know, Putin made his famous speech at the, or infamous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, and not many people in the West heeded the message. Well, I would take that back even further. And, you know, to me, one of the most clear messages that Putin made was right at the very start of his rule. In fact, 11 days before he became acting president of Russia, on the 20th of December, 1999, which is the Chikis Day, the day of the founding of the KGB, he was still prime minister. He went to Lubyanka Square in Moscow, the former KGB headquarters, to unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov, the longtime chairman of the Soviet KGB, the man responsible for, one of the people responsible for the invasion of Hungary in 1956 when he was ambassador there, one of the people, no, the main person responsible for political persecution of dissidents in the Soviet Union, especially for the horrendous practice of punitive psychiatry. Now, when the Prime Minister of Russia goes and unveils a memorial plaque to that guy, that's a pretty clear message. And a no less clear message was Putin's decision in the first year of his presidency in 2000 to reinstate the Stalinist-era Soviet national anthem as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. As we don't need to tell our Lithuanian friends who had also lived in the Soviet Union, Russia and, you know, in the Soviet Union was a country of symbols. And symbols and messaging is important. And again, I can't think of more clear symbols than a memorial plaque to Andropov and a national anthem of Stalin that Putin introduced in the first year of his presidency. And the West certainly did not heed that message either. So I think, you know, once there's a new political era in Russia, I think there'll be a lot of reckoning and a lot of lessons to be learned, not just on our side, but on the Western side as well. And finally, I want to address the very important point, the point and the question that Marie Mondras has raised. First of all, why the rush? Well, I think the most important answer is that, as Konstantin already alluded to, well, to put it in a nutshell, well, the Kremlin knows that their time is coming to an end. And it is a twilight, and it's absolutely indisputable. And we see it in the public opinion figures. We saw it very vividly in the Moscow elections last year, and the Kremlin saw it too. Now, you remember what happened in Moscow elections last year when most real opposition candidates were removed from the ballot. There were mass protests on the streets of Moscow last summer because of it. And many of these opposition candidates were not just removed from the ballot, but actually jailed and spent most of the summer in prison cells. And yet, a week before the vote, or a week or two before the vote, opposition leaders like Navalny and Gudkov and others basically called on people to go out and vote for just technical nobodies, some technical candidates, spoiler candidates in many cases, who are, always on the ballot to imitate competition. And in half of the districts in Moscow, pro-regime candidates, United Russia supported candidates, lost to these technical nobodies, which shows that so many people are now prepared to vote for, for the chair I'm sitting on, as long as it's not the candidate put forward by Putin. They heed those signals. I think one of the best stories from the Moscow election last year was what happened in Shukino, which is in the north of Moscow, where there was an opposition candidate, one of the leaders of the Open Russia movement, Alexander Solovyov, who was running for the Moscow Duma. He was barred from the ballot. He was jailed. But then there was another Alexander Solovyov on the ballot, the classic spoiler tactic where you put the candidate with the same name to confuse the voters. And I guess they forgot to take him off or something. And then a week before the vote, opposition leaders called on residents of that district to go and vote for the fake Alexander Solovyov. Now, he hadn't appeared in a district. He had not had a single rally. He hadn't met anybody. He has not spent a single, kopeck on campaign events. And he won in a landslide against the pro-Kremlin candidate. And the Electoral Commission actually spent about 3 days after the election trying to locate where this guy is to tell him that he's now an elected member of the Moscow Duma. And it's a humorous story, but there's a very serious point behind it. Again, that protest sentiments are rising to such an extent that people are prepared to vote for very literally anybody except the Putin-supported candidates. And of course, the Kremlin sees this, and they see the very clear trends in public opinion that are very, very visible from those links that I put in the chat when one of the participants asked for it. So they know they're running out of time. I think this is the most important response. And I think we see this rush even more now than we saw in January, because, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. Even according to official statistics, and it's a whole different conversation of how much we can trust official Russian government statistics, but even according to the official statistics, the infection rate for COVID-19 in Russia is higher than in all other European countries combined. That is official data. And in the middle of this, Putin is holding a week-long plebiscite event, whatever we want to call it, with millions of people participating. It's just a plain statement of fact that many people will die because Putin is holding this plebiscite. And so, yes, we see that they're in a rush. And they are in a rush, I think, because they know very clearly the time is running out. And one final point also in response to Marie's comment, she said that a lot of European or Western European media and institutions will accept this plebiscite as legitimate. Well, I think actually that we're kind of circling back to the point that I began with when we began our conversation. It is absolutely crucial that public opinion in the European Union and government institutions in the European Union, and especially parliamentary institutions in the European Union, leading with the European Parliament, the most important of them, makes it very firm and clear that this has nothing to do with democracy, that this has nothing to do with legitimacy, that this is a sham, that this is a fake, no less of a fake than the 99% elections that we all saw in the Soviet Union and other Soviet bloc countries. And it is very important that Putin is denied very firmly and clearly this legitimacy that he so desperately craves, because this plebiscite that we're witnessing is no more legitimate than plebiscites held before in Bolivia or Burkina Faso or Uzbekistan or Belarus, all those dictatorships that use these gimmicks to prolong their time in power. And so I want to end on this note because I think it's a very important one. European Union institutions should publicly, firmly, and clearly state that what's happening in Russia, beginning from yesterday and until next Wednesday, is the disappearance of the last remaining small vestiges of legitimacy that Putin regime may have still had until this moment, and that from this day on, or I suppose from next Wednesday, the 1st of July, Putin's regime belongs to the same category as the rogue authoritarian regimes that are not accepted in reputable circles anywhere in Europe or in the world.
Well, thanks, Vladimir, for strong message. We shall look how we can do it, you know. And Maria, please, yeah.
Thank you very much for interesting questions. I'm going to address two. First, your question, Prime Minister Kabul, is about why do we care at all, right? Was there really a rule of law in Russia in the first place? And why? What is new about these constitutional amendments? Vladimir already started answering that question. I just wanted to follow up. First of all, I just happened to finish a project with Levada Center, Russia's largest independent polling company, about the attitudes of the Russian population towards the rule of law. As a matter of fact, as we speak, by the way, the court in Russia just found guilty the defendants on the so-called 7th studio trial. I think it's worth mentioning. Again, just another example of unfairness of the Russian legislation. However, what's important to keep in mind that in the Russian judicial system, there's also a bunch of regular cases that are not political in nature, where, as we find of our report, the Russians, at least the Russian population, thinks that it actually works relatively well. This is so-called concept of the duality of the Russian law. When the case is political, then we have the so-called telephone justice and a bunch of procedures that are associated to the Soviet rule and the worst practices. But there is a group of more regular, ordinary sort of trials where the system worked relatively well. And in part, that's a legacy of the legal changes introduced under Russia's President Boris Yeltsin. You know, you may describe the current 1993 Constitution as imperfect, as very imperfect, and it's true. But nonetheless, some of the foundations in this Constitution definitely served the development of general norms and practices that are more consistent with the Western rule of law legal traditions. And as part, the foundations that were created in that Constitution that actually influenced the development of the Russian society, as we find in our report as well, and I'm happy to send the link to it, the modernizing trends within the Russian society are partly a legacy of the legal tradition founded under Yeltsin. What we see right now is a fundamental violation of those traditions for a bunch of reasons that we have outlined before. More than that, again, as Vladimir mentioned, the Russian regime now fundamentally changes. It used to belong to this group of relatively mild, soft autocracies, where despite all the violations, you know, the mass repressions were, for example, not a regular practice. By contrast, the new constitutional amendments directly put Russia, as I mentioned before, in a set of so-called despotic dictatorships or very tough personalistic dictatorships of post-Soviet or African types, where we can no longer talk about, you know, any softness on the side of the regime, and likely will be followed by even more repressive states and even more malpractices by the judicial system. And that, of course, probably is not going to alternate your opinion of Russia, but it is going to be felt by the Russian society and may limit the modernization processes that we've observed domestically over the recent years. This is why it matters. This is why it is important, and this is where we need the unified international standing that really, as Vladimir pointed out, really stands at defense of the previous legal norms. And my second answer will have to do with the question about who is next. I just wanted to very briefly mention that I think we, looking at Russia's foreign policy, we underestimate the importance of membership in the European Union and NATO, right? Despite the Kremlin's discretionary foreign policy, it still refrained from direct interference into the countries that, well, lucky to join NATO and EU ahead of time. And I have to say that the international standing and sanctions that are imposed on Russia as a result of the Crimea annexation and war in Ukraine actually have really are very important to decrease the Kremlin's eagerness to interfere in other countries' domestic affairs, and that should be underestimated, especially in light of the worsening domestic economic situation. Sanctions are definitely a huge constraining factor for further incursions in other countries. And lastly, in the polls, we also see that the society's attitudes towards foreign so-called geopolitical adventures is actually changing. And Russians are way less supportive of international adventurism when economic situation is as dire and when the economy is actually in decline. I myself done a couple of surveys that confirm that. As a result, it's not a given that any kind of incursion, military incursion in other country is going to give Putin and Kremlin as such a political boost as it did back in 2014. And once again, the international sanctions, of course, and commitment to resist it play a big role in this process. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Maria. And now we're asking Roland, your conclusions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'd like to finish on an optimistic note.
Yeah, good.
Concerning the Western reaction to all this. You know, that if we assume that the basic global conflict over the next couple of decades is going to be between democracy and autocracies, and that, you know, Russia played a big role here, is still playing a big role, China is coming to the foreground, but the reaction of the West must be a robust one. And then we can assume that the basic debate within the West is going to be between so-called realists and so-called idealists, or whatever you want to call them. And let me now quote two sentences from an article that was written by a very prominent figure that was mentioned here before at the beginning of the Corona crisis in the Wall Street Journal. The world's democracies need to defend and sustain their Enlightenment values. A global retreat from balancing power with legitimacy will cause the social contract to disintegrate both domestically and internationally. It's a bit convoluted, but what it really means is this is actually declaring null and void the claim of realism that it is the superior model because it safeguards stability, maybe at the temporary cost of values and freedom and ideals. What the author says here is that idealists are the better realists. The people who want to join legitimacy and power are the people who are more sustainable in the long run. And you know, the author is none else than Henry Kissinger. And you know, he's done a lot of things in his life and written and said things that I object to. But if he stands behind these two sentences, then we are on a good road of pushing back against the authoritarianism that manifests itself in this Russian constitutional changes.
Well, thanks a lot, Roland, also. And thanks to everybody, to all the panelists, you know, to Konstantin, Vladimir, Maria, Roland, really to all the participants. And despite you know, that the news really which are coming from Russia are not very inspiring, you know, but I think that we can agree on that conclusion, which perhaps was started to be spoken out by Konstantin, that this is twilight of you know, that post-imperial Russian, you know, I don't know how to call it, you know, architecture, and some new things perhaps will come. We do not know when and how, but definitely, you know, I am optimist, you know, and I'm always fighting with those who are saying, well, you know, democracy is not for Russia. You know, there are some leaders, you know, in Europe who are saying, you know, democracy is not for Russia. Let's adapt to Russia as it is, with Putin, you know, with all those, you know, nonsenses. I'm fighting with them very angrily, and I'm saying, no, you know, Russia will become democracy. The question is when, no, and how, but it will definitely happen. And let's not only, you know, hope, but let's do the job, you know. That is why we created this, you know, European Friends of Europe and Russia Forum. And thanks a lot again for your insights, you know, and let's keep in touch, you know, let's do our job, you know, really to push back and to show possibility of new Russia coming, you know, morning for new Russia should start after that twilight, you know. Thanks a lot again to everybody. Thanks a lot, Vladimir. Your links to you know, to some sources really are of very great value. We shall try to distribute them to all the participants. And again, you know,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Bye to everybody.